Welcome to this webinar hosted by Digital Square on intellectual property for global goods, an OpenLMIS case study. For those of you new to Digital Square, we don't usually have glitches like this, but typically we connect health leaders with resources necessary for digital transformation. One of the many ways we do this is by hosting webinars like this to help global goods communities thrive. Today, we're here to hear about OpenLMIS's recently conducted intellectual property exercise, where they tried to define IP parameters to ensure their growth as an open source global good, as well as having a thriving partnership with VitAlliance, a private sector company. In this webinar, the OpenLMIS team will share their journey of approaching an IP exercise, key considerations, and lessons learned. A few quick house rules. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our wiki at a little later this week. We'll ask that you mute yourself during the presentation so we can hear the speakers, and then we'll ask that you raise your hands during the Q&A when you want to ask a question. Today we'll be hearing from Brian Taliesin, Josh Zamor, and David Crew-Brown. Brian has been a part of the OpenLMIS community from before its inception, and has been supported the common requirements that went into the core functionality, as well as the vaccine additions added to the version 3. He is a longtime advocate of interoperability standards, and especially the data flow between supply chain and other health information systems. Josh was the software architect behind OpenLMIS version 3, which he re-architected to achieve governance through code to realize shared investment and benefit. Since the release of V3, Josh has served as the community steward and has helped the community understand which IP it has and how to approach evaluating licensing options during the stewardship transition. And then lastly, we'll hear from David, who is the GM of VitAlliance, an organization that partners with donors, ministries of health, suppliers, private sector, and faith-based organizations to transform humanitarian aid and pharmaceutical supply chains in Africa and emerging economies. He's a professional industrial engineer and has 24 years experience in supply chain. His most recent work has been in pharmaceutical supply chain in both private and public sector in sub-Saharan Africa. So without further ado, and again, my apologies, I will turn it over to Brian to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Verinda. And are you able to hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Okay, great. And Josh, are you able to share the slides?
Yeah, I can do that. One second here.
Yeah, well, thank you all for joining here today and for the fascinating conversation around intellectual property. Not something that folks often sort of discuss, except for in a lot of the contexts around all the work that we're doing for the U.S. government as well as others, and sort of the requirements around global access for the investments that they're providing. And so OpenLMIS, over its decades-long journey, has had to do a lot of that piece behind the scenes, and then especially as we were doing a bit of the transition with VitAlliance taking on more of the role of really having a deep review of the intellectual property and licensing pieces that we were looking at, and how does that sort of enable both that ongoing private sector public sector partnership. So Josh, go ahead and advance all the way up to the OpenLMIS journey slide if you could. There we go. This is great. And so with that, I mean, the OpenLMIS over these last 10 years has had sort of three main principles of it. One of this sort of the idea of that shared investment, shared benefit. Largely before this, there were multiple supply chains running in countries doing pretty much the same thing. Siloed investment, a lot of sort of pilotitis that was also happening. Yet as we started to pull all of those pieces together into one system, we also needed that aspect of where it was configurable and extensible. And so the additional features and functionality needed to be added to be able to support multiple programs, multiple process flows, and multiple decision-making models within inside of the country to be able to support the aspect of a single logistics and supply chain system at a subnational level across the country. And then the third piece, and this sort of goes to what's near and dear to my heart, this OpenLMIS is and all global goods are increasingly living inside of a digital health e-health architecture for the country, and so there needs to be that aspect of the information flowing between the different systems to be able to support informed decision making around around supply chain and how much commodities need to be stored at different locations at what time. And so with that, there has been a good amount of partners in this mix, with all of the logos across the top that have invested into that piece for that overall shared benefit, and then multiple partners that have been helping with the implementation, and then also even more partners that have been working on the deeper aspects of the code. And so I just want to thank them all for the sweat equity that has gone into the OpenLMIS. And in general, we want to sort of ensure that all of the work that they've been there continues to be accessible and usable for years to come. So with that, next slide. And the standard practices that we were seeing was largely on that left-hand piece, where there was we were basically supporting the digitization and the digital transformation of the country logistics systems. There were large amounts of paper-based processes that were there, and how do we move those requisitions and the order fulfillment and the stock inventory management into an electronic system that others sort of can get line of sight into that work. And then a key aspect around the data use is the analytics and reporting layer that's on top of that. And so that was sort of the core bread and butter of what OpenLMIS has. Yet realizing in that overall ecosystem, there are edge network environments where things needed to live offline or be disconnected. And that's where a little bit more of the mobile integration came on. And then, of course, as we were doing the cold chain support around the vaccine management, the equipment functionality, cold chain equipment inventory, that sort of came on board. And especially as we moved into the COVID edition in the recent years, even the aspects around tracking ventilators and their overall functional status. And so those features and functionality have again continued to be invested by multiple stakeholders, also all sort of demanding that intellectual property be retained and managed. So next slide. So, however, we also needed to see that what got us here to the 10 different countries that are using OpenLMIS and the tens of thousands of users that were on the platform, we needed to even continue to grow to maintain the viability and also the impact of this investment. And so we basically decided to pursue a partnership and went through a full sort of a year evaluation of this overall process. And through that, we overwhelmingly decided to pursue a partnership with Vital Alliance. And in general, this really provides us with a large, I think, upside of growth and an organization that is really aligned with the overall and shared vision of OpenLMIS. So I'm really excited for you to hear more from David a little bit later. Vital Alliance has already taken on the majority of the stewardship responsibilities during this transition, and they really are transforming how we manage both the governance, the scale in additional countries, how we sustain the platform through additional releases, and all the while maintaining the value of OpenLMIS's robust open source community. So next slide. And so one of the opportunities that Vital Alliance has been granted is to be the stewards of OpenLMIS, and our use across 11 countries. But yet in addition to that, Vital Alliance also provides supply chain services in several more. And so having that larger footprint in Africa is, I think, going to provide us some additional synergies and unlock some additional market opportunities. Yet commingling within the OpenLMIS intellectual property and licensing arrangement is something we had to consider. And it's something where smarter minds such as Josh's take over. So with that, I will pass it over to you, Josh.
All right, thanks, Brian. All right, well, thanks all. So we're going to be diving down into the case study, and this IP case study is available on the OpenLMIS website, as a white paper sort of thing. So you can go and read all the details. I'm going to kind of, some of the next slides here are a little dense, but we're going to try to take a quick, like high over, tour through that. So we're going to step through some of those things. And the first part that we have here is, why did we look at this? Like, why did we start this case study? And really, we had three reasons. The first is that we wanted to make sure, OpenLMIS has been developed for a number of years. And we wanted to find all the intellectual property that we have in OpenLMIS, that which we owned, that which is owned within the community. We also wanted to evaluate licensing options. We've had an open source license for a number of years, but we wanted to make sure that we looked at those licensing options to make sure that we could capture revenue for sustainability or made that a possibility. At the same time, while we're doing that, we need to make sure that we're meeting the requirements of the licenses of our software dependencies, and we'll get into that in a little bit. And then the third piece is that we wanted to make sure that we retained an open source community for shared investment and benefit. So that's really why we started this case study. And let's first just talk about what is IP, what is intellectual property, and what is licensing. So just at a very high level, IP is intellectual property. Anytime you create something, you automatically have intellectual property. It's not something that you need to register, or do anything special for. As soon as you create something, there is intellectual property, and you own it by default, unless you sign it away. So most employees, when they sign their employment contract with their employer, there's a clause in there that is going to assign that IP to their employer. And similarly, when many organizations are creating and signing contracts among themselves, they will be having specific IP sections that determines where any created IP is assigned. So the overall piece is there's lots of intellectual property that's out there, especially in a software product. And there's usually terms within contracts that is going to assign where that IP lives. The next part is licensing. And again, just a very high level, licensing is how an IP owner allows others to use, extend, alter, repackage, etc. any given IP, any given work. And really what is allowed and what is not allowed is all part of what's in the terms of that particular license. So in order to use a work of someone else's, you really need to be granted a license for that work. And really what you can do with that is all in the terms of that license. So when we talk about open source, this is a key way that we allow people to use the IP for OpenLMIS, for example, to take OpenLMIS and be able to use it, but also extend it, modify it, all of those things that we have in our license. And when OpenLMIS considers an open source license, we're using the definition and the licenses approved, through the open source initiative. And there's a lot of them that are out there. So there are almost 100 different licenses in that open source initiative that you can choose from. When we were looking at this study for OpenLMIS, we were really considering these 5 different elements of software IP. At a high level, you can kind of think of 2 different pieces. The first is copyright, and that was more what I was talking about in the previous slide, where as soon as you create something, you hold a copyright ownership for that intellectual property. In software, that's usually going to be the software code. Everywhere where we have code here, you should also think about documentation though as well. So code and documentation. And then the other one is the trademark. And these are your brands and logos for the software that can be registered, owned, and managed. Those are the kind of the high level pieces. And then we consider how inbound contributions. So these are things that developers and documentation authors write for software code and documentation. It may be governed by the project's contribution guidelines, staff employment terms, contract agreements between different organizations, that sort of thing. It's all the inbound contributions. And the other one is software dependencies. This is upstream software dependencies. This is going to be your software libraries. When we're writing OpenLMIS, we use a lot of other software. That software is licensed to us. And we have to choose open source licenses when we're choosing those dependencies so that we can build OpenLMIS. And then that all goes into the middle here, our software code. It should also, again, say software code and documentation. And we then license that out to everyone else. So our outbound usage for that code, for that documentation, is all licensed under our open source license that we grant the community. When we were looking at, what would we find important in this case study, is really these pieces here. So first, I mentioned a lot about an open source license. So of course, we're going to talk about the license. And here there are two really common ones to find that are out there. The first is the open source initiative, which I already mentioned. And usually these are licenses that you're going to apply to software code. The other one that's out there, and not to be forgotten, is Creative Commons. And usually people use this to apply it to their documentation. So those two are great places to go and find different licenses for your code and your documentation. The other thing we really wanted to make sure of is we knew what our inbound contributions were. And this is making sure that we know who has that contribution, who owns it, who it was that created it, who owns it, and then also how that contribution is licensed to us when we are putting that into OpenLMIS. And one place to find, there's a lot of different places to find contribution agreements, how to manage these inbound contributions. One place is Harmony Agreements. It has a lot of different templates that you can go, take and update for your needs, but it's a good place to start. And then for software dependencies, really important when you're starting an open source project or continuing one, know what your dependencies are, right? These are things that are changing constantly, updating, et cetera. You need to know what your dependencies are, and you need to enforce a good policy when you are selecting those software dependencies to make sure that they are compatible with your outbound software license. So those dependencies have licenses. They need to be compatible with your license as well. And then, of course, we're going to talk about revenue. So especially if using a strong copyleft license like we do in OpenLMIS, consider how that impacts your community's ability to sell proprietary access to those value-added services. Here, value-added services means software services, software code, and we'll get into that in just a bit. But especially when using a strong copyleft license, and that means a license that is very strong in how it ensures that that software code is always made available to all downstream users as a copyleft license. And then also trademark. Trademark is a little outside the scope of this case study, but we will talk about it briefly and really just make sure that, be deliberate about how your trademark, what your trademark is and how those trademark rights are utilized. It's a little bit complex, but we will touch on it a little bit. So in terms of what we found while we were going through this case study, the first is IP ownership, and we found that ownership is held for OpenLMIS v3 at Village Reach and JSI. And we also found that we were going to keep that unchanged, especially retaining ownership here at Village Reach ensures that there is a fiscal sponsor that matches donor rules and nonprofit requirements. So we've mapped out where all of our ownership, where all our IP lives at the different organizations. And we also found that it was good to keep it, where it is for now, but we're also going to be continuing to explore the need for a new owner longer term. Ideally, it's a fiscal sponsor that exists for more than one open source global good or global health goods. So that's our IP ownership, our license. We have a strong copyleft license. It's the AGPL v3, and we're also deciding to keep it. This is a strong copyleft license, so it ensures that the community that we have today remains strongly protected as open source. However, it also makes it really difficult to sell proprietary access, sell usage of software code, because it always guarantees that that code's available. However, we did find that OpenLMIS v3 microservice architecture allows for Vitalines to build new services that are licensed under a proprietary license and to sell access to value-added services, again, services being software services. And what I want to mention here is that this architecture makes it possible, it helps enable it, it doesn't guarantee it, of course. So when you're creating that new software service, you do have to keep in mind, is this software service as a total going to be, a derived work of OpenLMIS or not? But so far what we found in what we might be building for value-added services or what might be built for value-added services, that those would not be derived works. And microservice architecture helps ensure that there's clear boundaries between, what is OpenLMIS and what are those value-added services. Upstream dependencies, because we're not changing our license, we need to continue to just ensure our policy is enforced to have an OSI license, that our upstream dependency is licensed with an OSI license here. This is the open source initiative license, or one of the open source initiative licenses, I should say. And so we don't need to do anything different there. If we were to change the license, we might have to look back at some of our dependencies and make sure that anything that we change would be in agreement with our new license. But since we're not changing it, we don't need to do anything here. And we just need to continue enforcing our policy. And then one of our bigger changes is around our inbound contributions. And what we're going to be doing is essentially two things. First, the overarching thing we're going to be doing is making sure that we have a contribution agreement for all new contributions that go into OpenLMIS. This makes sure that we know, where the contribution is coming from and how it's licensed. So the big thing that we're going to be doing is making sure that most contributions will be signing a contribution assignment agreement, or CAA. And this helps make sure that we have fewer known IP owners, which makes it simpler to track what's owned by who and ensure the license is appropriate for that contribution. For some, we'll have, for select really, we'll allow them to sign a contribution license agreement, or contributor license agreement, I should say. And that CLA gives flexibility to the community to allow those select community members to contribute, retain their IP, and also agree that their contribution can always be relicensed to another open source license if needed. So it gives us some flexibility both for OpenLMIS as well as those select contributors. And then finally, trademark. We're not going to touch too much on this, but what we did find is that currently the OpenLMIS trademark is not currently registered. It does fall in common law use, and it could be registered later. And if we want to do that, it's been really important for us to ensure that we track when we started using that trademark, where we started using it, etc. And that's really only if we want to use it, only if we want to register the use later. Registering it could be helpful in the future to police the brand. We could designate the official version versus the non-official versions, those sorts of things. So far, though, the use of that trademark has always fallen within the community norms. And so right now, we're not going to be registering it. We don't see a need to do that. However, any future IP ownership transfer to that, like fiscal sponsor, for example, it might help to register it. And that's an option that the community can pursue in the future. So overall, in a nutshell, what should you be looking at? What does the community own, right? You want to make sure that you know what code, what documentation, what trademarks you have, all the different pieces of IP that are out there, and what is owned. You also want to know who owns it, right? Who the author is and what contracts were in effect when that work was created, to make sure you know who actually owns that piece. Is it a person? Is it an institution, etc. You also want to make sure that you have, if you don't have it today, an IP. You want to know how IP for inbound contributions work, right? These are going to be your contribution agreements. Things like CAA and CLAs are really important. You can find templates at Harmony agreements. And then you also want to make sure you have an outbound license. If you don't have one, make sure you have one. OpenLMIS is going to be staying with our strong copyleft license. It gives us protection. We have a way to work around some of its revenue pieces. So we're going to be staying with AGPL v3, but there are, of course, lots of different licenses that are out there. It's most important to have one. And then upstream dependencies. You need to know how, what you can do or not do with their license. You need to make sure that it works with your outbound license. And finally, the big piece here for us is revenue for sustainability for this case study. And this is, for us, it's possible to stay with a strong copyleft license, but it's enabled in part by our software architecture and what it is that we want to do. So making sure that we're focused in on what we can and can't do within those pieces is important. But software architecture helps us, this microservice architecture helps us move around some of those pieces. And the final thing here is be deliberate, right? You want to make sure that you are deliberate on everything that you own, the licenses that you have, and you understand them. And of course, there's always the disclaimer here, the little legalese at the bottom, or not legalese, which will actually say, consult your own legal counsel. This is what we found when going through this case study. But of course, there's lots of details. There's lots of details that aren't here in these slides that can't be in the case study because there are professionals that do these sorts of things. So if you do have detailed questions, you should be looking for your own legal counsel. Just don't take just our word for it. But this should get you on a good start. That's the overview for the case study. And with this, I'd like to hand it over to David.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks to Brian for the upfront intro. As you guys can see, I mean, this is quite technical in some ways around just the whole setup of open source system. So I think just to kind of recap a little bit and to think back to what Brian was saying at the start is that the idea of OpenLMIS and open source was really that all people get to use the system. OpenLMIS is there to be used, and it really is there available for all to use, but also for all to contribute. And that's that whole idea of shared investment, shared benefit. And really, I think our essence in that is to say, how do we make OpenLMIS a better system, a better tool as those contributions come in, but then navigating through what Josh just took us through with specific development and ownership of IP as that gets developed. But I think really the essence in what we've seen over the years with OpenLMIS is that we've had many contributions from many different role players, and that has helped us to add onto OpenLMIS and the functionality that we have today. I think the second point to note, which sometimes gets overlooked a little bit, is that when you do the implementation of OpenLMIS, the software is available. It's for free. It's there to be used, but there are costs involved as with any implementation. There's implementation costs, supporting costs in terms of getting the system up and running. There's hosting costs and infrastructure costs that need to be considered. And then future support in terms of making sure the system remains viable, sustainable. I think Josh mentioned it, that there needs to be an opportunity or a way of making sure that the system can be
David, I think we lost you there for a minute. Do you mind going back and repeating that? You still there?
Oh, we might have the load shedding happening in South Africa here, where it seems to take out down the mobile network. And I mean, maybe I can even just sort of up. I'll stop and see if David catches up. Yep, looks like we just lost him. Yeah. Yeah, so building on the second piece around, there's a lot more, while the software is free and open source, there's a lot more that's sort of involved with the overall sort of wrapper around that with hosting and support. And especially as we're moving the donor-funded model for the initial sort of start of OpenLMIS to sort of where a lot more players are involved, both private as well as public, in the care and feeding of the core of OpenLMIS. How do we sort of utilize, how do we sort of work within sort of the OpenLMIS licensing arrangement to be able to support that overall mix? And with that, Josh, what's next slide? Great. And so with this, and Pranil, also let me know if you want to sort of chime in on this as well, because as far as you also coming from Vital Alliance, you may be able to speak to this better than I am.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I wasn't prepared to talk today, but let me give it a go. Hi everyone, Pranil with Imperial, also working with David. But effectively, as Brian has said, with the donor funding coming to an end, obviously different vehicles and mechanisms need to be sought out. And I think with the way that the licensing has and the IP has been crafted, what Josh has taken us through, that gives us the opportunity to take certain services to various countries and markets, both in the private and government sector. So the first point around linking with other systems, OpenLMIS has got a very specific focus at the, let's call it the tail end of the supply chain, around the requisition process, and making sure that the areas that don't have a lot of network coverage or access to connectivity are able to still get their requisitions in and receive their stock, and hopefully in an accurate manner. And that's where OpenLMIS plays. We as Vital Alliance would try and link in that, let's call it foundational data, to get that upstream visibility going and offer services on top of that. Things like inventory optimization, forecasting, advanced forecasting, and intelligent allocations, that sort of stuff. And by doing that, we're hoping that you can take value even further up the supply chain, and grow on the base of what OpenLMIS has put into place. In terms of the support, Brian mentioned that obviously that was done by the previous stewards of Village Reach as part of donor funding, and we need to obviously as a community come together and make sure that there is some contribution that goes back into the sustainability of the software, and the viability of it going forward, so that it continues to evolve and doesn't effectively stagnate, because that would be a terrible waste given the amount of effort and the value that's currently being experienced through this software and the implementations that are live. The other component I believe David wanted to talk about was data commercialization, and there's a lot of value in just visibility of information, through to the, let's call it the manufacturers and the upstream suppliers, and that can definitely be reinvested back into the LMICs in various ways. So there's definitely value in terms of not just the use of the application, but the outputs of the application, being the data that's generated and that can be shared, upstream. And if I look at the last point here, I think the sentiment is that, as the community moves together on OpenLMIS, we ensure that there are certain standards and principles that are adhered to, so that implementations are seamless across various countries and future opportunities, and we prevent the code from deviating too far from what the core principles of it was, and that's what as stewards we will try to do in terms of providing guidance and implementations, and then supporting those countries and private sector clients thereafter on OpenLMIS. I hope that provides a good overview. I'll hand back over to, I think David, you're back, but I've covered this slide. I'm not sure how much of that you caught. If you wanted to add any high level sort of takeaways.
Yeah, just to apologize, I've got a few of my own technical problems here today. So yeah, thanks Pranil for jumping in. I did warn him that I might be a little bit volatile, but yeah, I really appreciate the time that we've had to share with you. Happy to take a couple of questions, and really I think the leaving message from my side, Rinda, is really to say that we need a strong community for OpenLMIS to continue to be viable going forward, and so we need people to be invested in it in terms of their own development, people to support the further, kind of maintenance of OpenLMIS, and really help us to try and get more of the paper-based ELMIS systems onto digital formats, and OpenLMIS is a great opportunity to do that.
Excellent point. Thank you, David. I think with that, we're going to open up to questions, if there are any from the team. As you all kind of think about what you'd like to ask, David just mentioned how important it is to have a community around OpenLMIS, and it makes me wonder if there's someone who wants to contribute a module to OpenLMIS or any sort of source code. How do you ensure that that stays open source? So how do you make sure that the community that is contributing is continuing to contribute in an open source way to the product?
Yeah, that's a great question. I could jump in real quick. Just so, as you're looking at contributing that module, the easiest thing to do with OpenLMIS is, when you're contributing a new service, I should say, is there is a service template, and that service template comes with all of the standard OpenLMIS license pieces within it. And so that is the AGPL v3. It's right in the module. It's right in the service definition, the template. So you can see all the pieces for it. It makes it easy to start from, and that license will always ensure that when you do, contribute that piece of code, it's always going to be that contribution will always be AGPL v3. The other thing to do is, of course, sign the new contributor agreement, and that's going to, ensure that OpenLMIS retains the ability to, take that contribution and work with it in the future, and make sure that we know who has it, where it came from, what we can do with it, all those pieces, and that's all those pieces are in the contribution agreement as well. But that is really, as soon as that is, put out there, it's the initial contribution is always going to be AGPL v3, and that's always going to be open source. Does that help?
That does, Josh. Thank you. Any questions from the audience?
Hey, I had a quick question. This is Satish from Chai. So a lot of the work that we do is with country governments or ministries of health. Typically, anything that we build, we build it on behalf of the government, right? So my question is, how does licensing work there? Like, does the MOH has to sign some sort of contributor agreement, or can Chai represent the MOH? Because it's not that, even though we are writing a piece of code, for instance, it's not Chai IP, it's the MOH IP, right? So how would that work in this, and how do we sensitize the government about contributing back to the OpenLMIS product?
Yeah, well, great question. So the first part is, it sounds like, if you have an agreement with the Ministry of Health that says that they retain the IP, and they want to make sure that that is open source, they need to make sure that they are licensing that, with an open source license. There's some debate on this, what is an open source license, but generally it's very well understood that a license within the open source initiative are open source licenses. So one of those, 100 some odd licenses that are in there, that's a great place to start. If you don't have a license, of course, it becomes really murky. You don't really necessarily have the right to use, that piece that they own. So definitely make sure it has a license. If it's in the OpenLMIS context, right? Like if the question is really, about like how this works with OpenLMIS, in order to contribute that back to OpenLMIS, like have that be part of the OpenLMIS, broader community, you're going to need to sign one of these contributor agreements. And there it's up to, essentially OpenLMIS governance to, figure out if you can take, the standard contributor agreement, or if you can take the contributor license agreement. And the difference there is, one is assigning the ownership back to OpenLMIS. That's the standard one, and that makes it easier for OpenLMIS to work. But we do grant, special consideration for those that really want to retain their IP. But if you go through that contribution agreement, the contributor license agreement, you'll see that there's clauses in there to make sure that that contribution is licensed in an open source way, that we have to do that. Otherwise we can't, take a contribution that's not open source. And it has to be, relicensable under any other open source license within the open source initiative. And that gives, again, flexibility for the community to make sure that things keep moving forward. Does that help answer the question?
Yep, it does. Thank you, Josh. And the second part on how do we sensitize the ministries, this is specifically because, in theory, contributing back to an open source product, it makes total sense. But somebody has to sign off on that decision, right? And it's easier to retain the IP and not worry about that than go through the licensing, terms and conditions, and somebody at the ministry signing off on that. So this is not only for OpenLMIS, but I'm assuming this could be a question for pretty much any global good that we work with.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure that I've had too much pushback. I haven't experienced that myself. To have too much opportunity to help sensitize folks to it, or ministries of health, I should say. I think the simplest message, of course, is if it is open source, it helps ensure that it is out there, right? That the piece is out there. It's guaranteed that people can use it, extend it, all those things that are in the license. And that helps, with you could start talking about the 4 fundamental freedoms and those sorts of things. But the other piece that I might go to first before those is there are a number of books that have been written on the subject. I think one of the better ones that's more recent is Nadia Eghbal's Working in Public. That might have some better ideas on how to sensitize folks to working in open source. VM Broster also has a book as well. I forget the title, but it says open source right in it. But those two are great resources. But I'm wondering if Brian or others, do you have any thoughts on helping sensitize?
David might have a response.
Yeah, I did want to add one thing. Hopefully my connection holds this time. So I think for me, the one thing to communicate to departments of health and ministries of health is that as different contributions come in, I think for one, as Josh says, we need to make sure that can be added back into the product. And that's a whole shared investment, shared benefit opportunity. But as they come in, if it's written in a way that's standard and if all the agreements are in place, that then adds to the product. And as the product matures and gets more functionality and gets built out, then everyone can benefit from that. So for departments to be part of that benefiting, they can kind of keep their code to themselves and I suppose not share it, but will they then be enabled to continue benefiting from the code growing with other contributions from other places? And so I think that's probably for me the big thing to say, this is an open source. It is the value of that is to make sure that everyone gains the benefit of it, and in that way encourage them to kind of be in that mindset and space of contributing to the product.
Thanks, David. Any other questions? All right, I'll throw one in just since we've got a few more minutes. We've talked about bringing in ministries of health. We've talked about other stakeholders adding modules to OpenLMIS. What about donors? So if you have a donor that requires a global access commitment, what does that mean, and how do I ensure that I can provide that kind of commitment when I'm working on a system like OpenLMIS?
So I can chime in on that one a bit. This is Brian here, and if any of you on the call here have worked with Digital Square, they often will sort of incorporate some of this type of language in there. And so going back to slide 9 that Josh had shared around the inbound and upstream dependencies, and that's a bit of that global access contributions and commitments that that you'll see in that type of language. And so the aspect that you can still retain the ownership of the project IP, but as part of the global access commitments, you have to provide and either be part and have one of the open source initiative approved licenses for the inbound contributions. And then also in addition to that, that anything that you're incorporating into that project work that's being funded by those donors, you also are ensuring that the upstream dependencies, or in the Digital Square language, the sub-recipient prior IP is included in that software code that you're providing. If you don't have that overall open source initiative approved license that's in that mix, then within Digital Square, there is this piece around just the aspect of Digital Square then takes on a bit of the licensing for that global access commitment on your behalf.
Thank you, Brian. All right, we've got a few more minutes left. Any other questions? Okay, well, if that's it from everyone, I will just say thank you to our speakers for joining us and walking us through this case study for OpenLMIS. Brian, Josh, David, and Pranil, thank you so much for taking the time. And again, my apologies for our technical difficulties. It was quite the roller coaster today, but I appreciate everyone who was able to join, and we'll send out a recording of this in a few days. Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure.